Okay, welcome to this week's home group tutorial video, and we're looking at the life of Ruth from Ruth chapter 1. And just as an introduction, to remind you that it's amazing, Ruth was an amazing woman, and it is amazing that the book of Ruth is in the Bible because she had a lot against her. She was a Moabite, and the Moabites were enemies of Israel. She was a woman, and women weren't highly regarded in those patriarchal times. And she was a widow, and widows were considered to be perhaps cursed by God. But Ruth was a woman of great faith, and her story is included as one of the books of the Bible, and she's the great-grandmother of King David and part of the genealogy of Jesus. So she had great faith, and we can learn from her faith. These days, the modern term that some people use is resilience, and resilience is the ability to bounce back after some sort of a crisis. And so the first question I've got is, why are some people more resilient than others? And people can face similar crises, and yet some people bounce back and others don't. Do you think it's a personality thing? Do you think it's part of our upbringing? Is it our culture or is it in our genes? Have a little talk about that to start with. The second thing I want us to talk about is that sometimes we feel God has given us a raw deal, and we start to wonder why things happen to us that don't seem fair. Life doesn't always seem fair. And I want you to really look and think about Romans 6:23, which is a very well-known verse, and then try to identify two of the theological misconceptions that are based behind us complaining about God, and just have a chat about that. We start life as consumers, and firstly Naomi was she was a complainer about God, and then Orpah was a consumer. She was happy to hang around Naomi while she got what she needed, which was her husband. And when Naomi couldn't offer her any more, then she went back to her people. So we live in a consumerist culture. And do you agree with that for a start? And if you do, how do we move from being consumers to contributors? What is it about being a consumer that stops us from growing in our faith? And then Ruth was a contributor. So we had three different responses from these three women to adversity and crisis. They'd all lost their husbands. Naomi complained, Orpah consumed, and Ruth contributed. So how do we get to the point where we're contributors? You might want to discuss this quote. Rick Warren said that Christianity turns consumers into contributors. How does that happen? How do we learn to be givers? And you can look at some verses there from Ruth and also from the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus challenges us to give up our lives in order to gain our lives. And then we see his great example in the Garden of Gethsemane when he said, "Not my will, but your will be done." So I'm hoping that this week you'll have a chat about those three responses to crisis and how faith can sustain us in those difficult times. And in my sermon I talked also about Jesus' story about the wise and the foolish builders and building your house on the rock rather than on the sand. What does that mean, to build our lives on the rock? And how do we sustain that, and how do we build that foundation on a daily basis? Have a great study, and I hope this has helped.